friends, your next presentation on tyre processing in the NT from Urban EP. We have Nathan Marlin and Nathan Toovey. Would you mind putting your hands together and welcoming Nathan to the stage? Where's your other Nathan? Only one Nathan?
So how we got this, cool. So you've got Nathan Toovey here. Nathan Marlin and business partners over there in the back right of the room. Thanks very much for giving us some time today. You might recall we were at the Elegant conference last year, although delivering it remotely with TSA's Liam O'Keefe. Great that we're able to make it here in person. Apologies on behalf of Lena Goodman, CEO of TSA. She was unable to make it today. However, there are also some other members of the TSA team here in the room. Shout out over there to Tammy and Sandra. So if you've got any queries around the exciting stuff that TSA is doing in this space, please hit them up. On the other hand, if you're really excited about some of the more technical details for the work that we did, you can speak to Nathan or I. Is that loud and clear? Terrific, thank you. So yes, just to bring you all back into the frame, when we spoke about a year back, it was early days in this project. The project was really around trying to determine, is there a case for greater tyre recovery in the Northern Territory? Because it was very early days, I think all we really got into last year was an introduction to TSA and also an introduction to the scope of the project and maybe some preliminary information around what the present status for tyre management looks like in the Northern Territory. So I guess to top it all off with an introduction, Urban EP, Nathan Marlin and myself, we were engaged from about March last year through to the end of last calendar year to really look at, okay, well, what is the business case for recovering tyres in the Northern Territory to a greater extent? What is the path forward? What does that look like? How do you then get there? What sort of interest can we generate from the different people that could possibly have a role or an interest in recovering tyres to a greater extent in the Northern Territory? And how can we sort of foment some interest based on the distribution of different benefits and the different roles people can play in that space? Partners to the project were Elegant, thanks very much, Meredith and Peter for your input across the project, and also from the Northern Territory Government as well. So some of the broader questions that we asked and answered throughout the project were basically what sorts of tyres are being generated across the Northern Territory, from which sectors, in which locations, what sorts of options could be available to recover tyres to a greater degree, what do those supply chains and markets look like, where would the different sort of operating facilities potentially be located, what are the barriers that are hindering investments to recovering tyres in the Northern Territory, and what are the different views of the stakeholders to make sure that we're really capturing what the broader views of the different parties involved is in terms of like the key challenges, the main impediments, what sorts of things they'd like to see changed in order to then get behind what a solution might look like. So we talked at length to, I think, probably a number of people in this room from local and regional councils. We spoke to folks from Nhulunbuy, the Territory Government, so DIPL, Northern Territory EPA and other parties. Those that are currently active in recycling tyres from the Northern Territory to a small extent, and those that might be interested in stepping into the market up here, and some other industry organisations. We spoke to Rint, and obviously we talked closely to Legant where relevant. So we're going to try and avoid jargon as much as we can, but if I do slip down that path, here are some of the sort of acronyms that often come up. Quite often people talk about EOLTs, that simply means end-of-life tyres. Tyres that basically at the end of their current usage that are stripped from cars and then need to be managed in some capacity. EPU is another language that quite often comes up, equivalent passenger units. All we're really talking about there is, say, the mass of an individual sort of passenger car tyre at the end of life. 8 kilograms or 125 EPUs is equivalent to a tonne of end-of-life tyres. I'm going to try and speak in tonnes, not tongues, or in terms of EPUs as often as I can. And then TDP gets slung around a bit as well. That means tyre-derived product. And that can mean, as a catch-all, a variety of different sort of products that come out of tyre processing technologies. It could be, for example, a shred which is used as a waste-derived fuel. It can be a crumb rubber or a granule or some type of aggregate. And then there's also quite often steel within the frame of the tyre that is then readily recoverable depending on the technology you're using. And finally, OTR tyres, that's a big one, currently very popular in the lingo at the moment. We're talking about off-the-road vehicle tyres, so what are we talking about? Sort of earth movers, graders, bulldozers, tractor tyres, things of that nature. Historically, they've been pretty challenging to deal with for a variety of reasons, which we'll step into to some extent. But suffice to say, OTR tyres is very relevant to the Northern Territory because of the volumes involved in the Northern Territory in terms of total tyres and the contribution that OTR tyres makes to that total contribution. Chances are you'll need a solution that involves being able to process off-the-road tyres in some capacity in order to get a solution up. So, some challenges faced in the Northern Territory in particular. In the past, there hasn't been a huge amount of investment in tyre processing capability as yet, so you're starting from a very low base. There's a lack of volume density and an overall lack of volume relative to other parts of the country as well, which means that those that may step into and invest in a solution in the Northern Territory are always going to compare against where they could allocate that same amount of financial capital somewhere else and potentially get a better return on investment. And then there are also obviously some challenges in enforcing regulations around, say, illegal dumping, poorly managed stockpiles, things of that nature as well. And then also we have to also acknowledge that a lot of public bodies don't necessarily have a depth of resources and expertise in the area that allows you to kind of build momentum around a solution. Having said that, there are some pretty strong positives. Firstly, some councils are already stockpiling tyres in a relatively managed way, as opposed to sort of a poorly managed way, in readiness for a solution to arrive. Large mining companies who in the past have been quite resistant to the notion around having responsibilities to recover tyres are starting to step up. They're less resistant than they used to. And then obviously we're seeing some movement in the policy space with the circular economy strategy being released and work towards some sort of model for a waste levy, which is a conversation for later today. All those things may build towards making recovering tyres easier to do than in the past. And in many respects, it's about how do you shift the operating landscape such that somebody has confidence to step into the market as opposed to continually holding back because there are more attractive markets elsewhere in the country. So why does it matter? Well, from the negatives, obviously there are some major impacts for illegal dumping, and when we spoke to different stakeholders at length, everyone was pretty frustrated about illegal dumping. We're talking about remote regions and councils, we're talking about urban councils, we're talking about Northern Territory government parties that are responsibility for Crown land and the clean-up costs associated with tyres. The tyres in the landscape themselves, they spoil the landscape, there's a fire risk, there's a vermin and disease vector risk, things of that nature. And broadly speaking, when people see tyres on the side of the road or they see them in the landscape, it just sends the wrong message to the community, right? And it's not the communities, it's not the sort of message that you really want to set out there. Obviously, there's a lack of resources. At the moment, every tonne of tyres that gets put into landfill, you're losing a lot of rubber material, steel, other resources that could potentially be used, and they're just foregone, neglected. And then on that same note, that landfill space, which is also a limited resource by design, by regulation, is also being not put to the best use as well. And that's particularly a challenge for some of the landfills in the communities where they actually don't have much landfill resource. We heard stories during engagement that you may get some operators that were basically driving in by night to these unstaffed landfills, dumping a whole bunch of tyres in and then heading off again. It's not their community landfill. They might be operating from, say, 100, 200 kilometres away, but now that resource has basically been taken away from those people that were there to legitimately use that landfill space. And again, the final point there, it really is really not quite the message that I think accords with the community values of the Northern Territory, be that around caring for country, corporate social responsibility or ESG principles that are now getting more and more airtime, and obviously some of the principles that the Northern Territory government is trying to encourage through the circular economy strategy. Obviously, disposing of tyres to landfill is out of lockstep with that. Some of the benefits more broadly, if you were to turn that around, well, obviously resource efficiency and displacing demand for virgin material. Reduce contamination and spoilage, so basically reversing all those issues around contaminated lands, be it Crown land, council land, mining leases, or lands that is under the care of traditional owners. Local and regional employment, that's another benefit. If the predominant commercial activities are occurring in the Northern Territory, obviously if all of those activities are occurring interstate, when then a lot of those economic benefits are obviously being transferred to other parties. So we have to bear that in mind. And the fourth point, which might be a little bit subtle, but I think is important, to get a solution around tyres is pretty important from the perspective that it shows that the partners in Northern Territory government that are in Northern Territory the government and other parties, if you can find a solution, it shows that you're able to work through the challenges that are unique to the Northern Territory and perhaps replicate some of those successes in other areas, be it sort of other end-of-life products, other problem materials, be it, say, plastics, things of that nature as well. So I think that's really important. Northern Territory is not in the same sort of situation where you can just kind of go, well, what do they do in Victoria? What do we do in New South Wales? We'll just take that solution and we'll move it to the Northern Territory. Clearly it doesn't work like that at all. So now a little bit about the profile of end-of-life tyres in the Northern Territory. About 4,900 tonnes are generated each year. About a third of that is, say, mining and other sort of large vehicle tyres. And the remaining two-thirds, well, let's say two-thirds of that again, so say just under 50%, 43% is sort of larger sort of on-road tyres like truck tyres, bus tyres, things of that nature. And about a quarter of the overall volume is basically car and motorbike tyres. Now, of those tyres, a total of about 12% altogether, which is really around 18% of the passenger car and truck tyres, is recovered through activities, say, in Adelaide and Melbourne. The vast majority of other tyres, including all the mining tyres and the majority of passenger and car tyre and truck tyres, are basically either landfilled, for example, in Shoal Bay, or in sort of other local facilities, for example, say in Alice Springs, Tennant Creek or Katherine, are basically lost to the environment, are stockpiled in the hope that there will be a solution. So in effect, there's a long way to go to recover tyres from the Northern Territory across all different locations. From a geographic standpoint, I don't know how well this looks from where you are. This comes up more clearly in the TSA brochure, which is available from TSA's website. This is meant to be a schematic of the Northern Territory, the far north being sort of the majority of tyres generated from, say, Greater Darwin and surrounds, say of the order of around 1,800 tonnes of tyres. And then you've got perhaps around another 200 tyres from, say, Alice Springs and surrounds, Tennant Creek and surrounds, and Katherine and surrounds. And then roughly another, say, 1,600 tyres from the mining sector. Large stockpiles at the moment, strewn throughout Darwin through, I think there was a rogue operator that has since stopped working in the sector, a large stockpile in Katherine, and then some smaller stockpiles elsewhere. And then you've also got OTR tyres. They're represented in the yellow circles there, largely where you see large mining operations, so Gove Peninsula, Groot Island, MacArthur River, and I think perhaps there's another one around Newcrest as well. So in doing our work, we considered two different recovery options for improving tyre recycling recovery from the Northern Territory. Option one would be, okay, well, how about ramping up the amount of tyres that are currently being recovered through interstate activities? So what we're really talking about there is really sort of pushing a larger supply of materials through those existing channels. So what we're talking about is trying to get more tyres into the recovery pathway, fostering greater sort of transport efficiencies, and then also pressuring and supporting the mining sector to then get involved rather than sort of holding back. Option two would be to consider investment in a crumbing and granulation facility somewhere central in the Northern Territory. Why somewhere central? The reason being predominantly because if it was situated, say, in Darwin, while that's closer to a large amount of tyres, it would be a bit of a struggle for some of the more southernmost points of the Northern Territory to be able to access that facility. So if it was located down further south, be it Katherine or Tennant Creek, it might be more accessible for more tyre generators, including mining tyres. So that's some of the thinking around that. Now, in option two, there's also the issue that the end markets in the Northern Territory aren't so well developed yet. So you would need to stimulate or make sure that whoever it is that's setting up a facility can find a home for whatever it is it's producing, be it crumb rubber and granule. So we had to look at that as well. And when we did the analysis, we found that basically you could possibly get to a recovery level of the order of around 3,500 tonnes. We'll look at that detail a little bit later. But you'd also want to look at the case where the volumes are much smaller, because you need to allow for a ramp-up period if you're trying to set up a facility in the Northern Territory. You can't take for granted that they're going to win contracts worth, say, 3,000, 4,000 tonnes of tyres from the very first year. Just conscious of time, I might have to step up a bit. But if you want us to linger anywhere, we can always talk a little bit towards the back end. This is the profile that we took from the project in order to hit that 75% recovery target. So 90% of tyres from, say, Darwin, Catherine, Tennant Creek and Alice Springs. Smaller numbers from remote communities. An increase in the capture of tyres that are currently lost through illegal dumping, and being able to get 75% of mining tyres on board. If you hit those numbers, you should be able to get to 3,500 tonnes. So that could be a target around setting some sort of interventions or execution plan. And we also checked in during the work by looking at the operating costs of setting up a service for each of those different segments, allowing for different locations across the Northern Territory as well. And if any of the numbers look like, okay, well, it only works if, say, the recycling fees are something like $2,000 a tonne, then that allows us to say, well, look, some of those assumptions are out of whack. It doesn't hold. It's just not credible. So we ran the numbers that way too. So we're going to look at 3 slides around what that comparison revealed. Firstly, there's a question around, okay, can these solutions compete with, say, the prevailing practice of sending tyres to landfill? And the answer is a resounding yes. When we engaged with the market, we found out that, say, the cost to send tyres to landfill that were being charged to the community were in the order around $5 or $6 per passenger car tyre, $600 to $700, $750 per tonne. When we ran the analysis for both interstate recovery and recovery via a Northern Territory facility, they fell around that bound, which is to say, well, cost competitiveness isn't necessarily a factor. In the case of, say, a local recycling facility, you obviously need to hit a certain number so that you can spread the capital cost across a larger volume than otherwise, so that's a factor. But there's no compelling reason to say, okay, well, it can't compete, and if you're to force people to use a recycling solution, you're just going to push people out to, say, illegal disposal. It shouldn't work like that. So then we looked at some of the advantages and disadvantages purely outside of some of the financial issues, because there are other strategic commercial risks. In the case of, say, interstate recovery, it's got a benefit in that you don't have to try and hit a minimum number. You can start to basically increment and ramp up the number of tyres being recovered without having to worry about whether or not you need to hit a minimum threshold for viability. Strong end markets and supply chains already exist. Tyre-derived fuel, crumb rubber and granule in interstate and overseas markets are healthy, so that's not really an issue. The current facilities, say for example in South Australia and Victoria, are in a mature regulatory environment. You don't have to worry about whether or not there's going to be a good sort of match between what the tyre recovery facility is trying to do and what the regulatory regime is trying to do. And obviously, because there's no additional capital at risk, there's not an additional sort of premium that needs to be attached to that solution. However, it comes with very high freight costs, both in terms of economic costs and obviously greenhouse gas impacts. Competition in end markets, because if it's sending the material to Adelaide or say Melbourne, there's a lot of tyre recovery already happening down that way, and that actually has an effect of suppressing the prices for the materials that you're trying to recover. In the case of tyre-derived fuel, where basically the tyre material gets shredded up and then sent to a cement kiln or a burner or a furnace overseas, there are currently some major issues around access to shipping containers and the costs associated with that. And as mentioned before, if there are any sort of economic benefits, in effect, they're basically transferred somewhere else outside of the Northern Territory. On the flip side, if you set up in the Northern Territory, those economic benefits, those materials are retained for local beneficial use. Very low freight costs, although there are some freight costs if you're located, say, further away from a facility. Say in Alice Springs, say, tyre generator may end up having to pay more to send material up to Tennant Creek or Catherine, for example. The facility in generating crumbing and granulation, these are relatively stable products with relatively high prices. And the fact that there isn't any competition in the Northern Territory means that they're able to usually get some sort of premium on their price as well. And we've seen that in Western Australia, although that's changing now that there's more competition in that market. Whoever it is that sets up here can use whatever sort of technologies and facilities make sense for the Northern Territory market, as opposed to just basically having to basically bolt on Northern Territory material to an existing business model that's based elsewhere. On the downside, the local markets and supply chains are yet to coalesce around being able to use crumb rubber and rubber granule in different sort of endpoints, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. The regulatory environment hasn't formed up yet, so is that going to present a risk around somebody's plans to set up a facility? Does it lead to a time lag or some sort of delay in getting return on investment from putting capital down into a facility? Those things need to be managed. And there's also obviously a higher level of capital at risk, particularly during the earlier years when maybe they're starting off with, say, 1,000, 2,000 tonnes per annum being processed when they really need to hit 3,500 or so. Just another look at that question around end markets. It's obviously a critical thing. Nobody wants to set up a facility to recover tyres in the Northern Territory only to find out that nobody wants their product, so that's a pretty big question. So if you look at, say, setting up a facility that's processing 3,500 tonnes per annum, you'd be looking at perhaps generating 1,700 tonnes of crumb rubber for use, for example, in road applications, about 600 tonnes or so in rubber granule, for example. That can be used, for example, in civil applications, be it, say, lightweight concretes, permeable pavements, soft fall surfaces in playgrounds and sporting fields, and steel, well, about 1,000 tonnes of steel, and obviously steel recovery markets are relatively mature, so less of a problem there. When we looked at, say, road construction sector, typical year on year, we saw that there was a road building and maintenance effort that would allow for, say, about 2,000 tonnes of crumb rubber being used if it was to replace the existing polymer binder in some road usages. In the case of, say, granule, potentially if you shifted from, say, traditional non-permeable pavements and moved to something like, say, a permeable pavement, which has benefits around, say, stormwater management, inundation management, things of that nature. The city of Darwin, just through its network of footpaths and so on, could absorb something in the order of around 1,000 tonnes of granule, so that matches as well. And then there are other niche applications that may emerge over time, the playgrounds, defence infrastructure, sporting fields as well, that are outside of those 2,000 tonnes of crumb rubber and 1,000 tonnes of granule. So it could potentially be workable, but it takes a bit of time and effort in order to make sure that those markets open up in a way that doesn't lead to deferred investment in a solution in the Northern Territory. So, bringing it all together, is a tyre recovery facility viable in the Northern Territory? Well, from what we've looked at, the costs are competitive against landfills, so that's not an issue. If you were to set up in the Northern Territory, there are more benefits that accrue to the Northern Territory community: jobs, local resource use, things of that nature. The benefits of using crumb rubber in roads as opposed to, say, not, because the benefits are quite clearly understood. But we have to remember that a facility in the Northern Territory, in order for it to work, needs to be able to amass a larger proportion of the tyres that are generated. So if the question was to be asked, can it sit side by side with, say, a large volume going to an interstate solution and being able to support a facility in the Northern Territory? I don't think those two things are compatible at the same time. You need to work out, okay, is this something that we want? Okay, yes, it is. All right, we've got to get behind it now. And what does that getting behind look like? It looks like around making sure that you've got the right conditions around being able to supply tyre material to that facility, and also having the right conditions downstream so that the end markets are there willing to take the material over the time frame that satisfies the asset lifespan. So we would think from our work, the local option may be optimal, but it needs a strong upfront commitment from numerous parties that may have an involvement in order to generate the right compelling atmosphere for someone to want to invest in a solution. So this is just an overview of how it might work. On the left-hand side, supplies from, say, mining and other industries, passenger cars, trucks, buses, etc. In the case of mining tyres, they would be fed into some sort of facility that is either sectioning, debeating, or perhaps fragmenting the tyres into a workable volume as opposed to, say, a 4-tonne, 4-metre diameter sort of unit. Feeding that material along with other material that's being received from passenger cars and truck tyres into, I guess, a centralised crumbing and granulation facility. And then the different streams that come out of that involve basically crumb rubber, which would then probably most likely go to road applications, as is the case in the rest of the country. Steel, obviously going to steel markets, and then Granule having a variety of different civil, soft fall, other niche applications as well. The right facility would be able to convert passenger car tyres into a crumb that's of a similar grade to if you use truck tyres, and so you've got an ability for that facility to pivot from different markets one way or another depending on what's the most attractive to that facility according to the market conditions at play. So that's how it would work overall, but there's a lot of work that's needed in order to make it happen. Where to from here? Well, at the moment, TSA and other partners are promoting the Northern Territory's Recycling Modernisation Fund, given that tyres are an eligible stream for the current program, although applications close later this month. TSA is also engaging with Legant and the Northern Territory Government to, I guess, hold a workshop with industry bodies that may have a role in the solution, trying to work out what is the path forward for a pilot in one or more end markets. It could be around roads, it could be around permeable pavements. There might be a variety of different solutions that are worked through in parallel. But then also understanding what are the other barriers at play and who has a role in trying to alleviate those barriers. And they could be at the front, say regulatory in nature. They could be around, say, procurement of tyre recovery services at a group scale, which may have a role for local governments. It could be around, well, what is the solution for those remote parts of the community and regional councils that otherwise struggle to be part of this, yet at the same time you know that their volumes have a role to play in making sure that a local facility is viable. All those kind of questions will be nutted out of that workshop, and then if it all goes to plan, there'll be a path forward. People will understand what they need to do, how they need to work together in order to bring the next phase to fruition. Thanks very much, everyone. How am I tracking for time? Perfect. Good, thank you. Tough.